Responsible for the lineup of critically acclaimed titles such as Battletoads, Donkey Kong Country, GoldenEye, and much more, Rare was on cloud 9 in the late 90s. Though it doesn't end there, as they bank their next big hit on a bird and a bear, whom we know as Banjo Kazooie. But how did it all start? Well, let's take a step back to the mid-90s right after the release of Donkey Kong Country 2. Rare had mastered one of the most advanced graphic technologies on consoles at the time, called ACM, and they decided to create a new IP on the Super Nintendo codenamed Project Dream. The game was going to be about the adventures of a boy named Edison. Quoting from creative director Greg Mills in an interview on Retro Gamer, he says, "Edison was a boyish adventurer who inadvertently got tangled up with a bunch of no-good pirates, led by Captain Blackeye. But as development went on, they began to feel that Edison was too generic, so they turned him into a rabbit. However, a rabbit that ran on 2 legs was a bit weird, so they finally settled with a bear." Everything was going as planned until Nintendo revealed their next-gen console, the Nintendo 64. And obviously, with new technology, ACM was now obsolete, so development for Dream switched over to the N64. Luckily, the team was able to carry over most of the supporting code, so the transition from 16-bit to 64-bit wasn't a huge setback. At this point, Banjo was just on his own, with only a backpack he used to carry items with. According to Greg Mills, the team wanted to give Banjo the traditional double jump for getting out of trouble and to cover more distance. However, it looked a bit awkward, so they decided to have wings come out of his backpack. They later even added a pair of fast-running legs. And since all these body parts were coming out of Banjo's backpack, the team decided to create another character that lived in it. Hence, Kazooie was born. On top of the duo sharing moves, the team gave Kazooie a sarcastic wit as a contrast to Banjo's good-natured charm for good measure. Nintendo actually had a hard time understanding the self-deprecating humor and never-ending torrent of sarcasm that Kazooie had. But even so, that didn't prevent the game from being popular in Japan. Banjo Kazooie was released in June of 1998 for the N64. The game was potentially gonna be called Banjo Kazoo, since Rare was planning to name the bird after the instrument it was playing, the kazoo. But because of trademark problems, they settled with Kazooie. I'm actually glad it turned out to be Banjo Kazooie. It rolls off the tongue much more nicely than just Banjo Kazoo. The story takes place in Spyro Mountain, where a witch named Gruntilda learns from her cauldron that Banjo's sister, Tootie, is the most beautiful girl of all. A fun fact is that Gruntilda was inspired by Grotbags, the bumbling incompetent witch from Emu's Pink Windmill Show. Becoming extremely jealous, she goes and kidnaps poor Tootie and plans to steal her beauty using a swapping machine. Banjo and Kazooie then set off on a journey to save her. Right as you take your first few steps, you'll be greeted by a mole named Bottles, who acts as your tutor throughout the game. According to Greg, his character was inspired by the typical clever kid in every school that wore really thick glasses. Personally, I felt that Bottles' voice made his nerdy aura stand out even more, and this goes for all characters. Even normal collectible items will talk to Banjo, and in turn, this gave the game so much life. Greg explains why they decided to use mumbling instead of actual speech, and I quote, "Back then, speech for games was still in its relative infancy, and less than convincing speech heard in some games.
I've been waiting for you, friends."
Goldman, do you know what you're doing?
Made us feel that it didn't really add to the experience. Speaking of personality and charm, Banjo Kazooie is filled to the brink with it, varying from the fluent music transitions composed by Grant Kirkhope, all the way to the unique themes of each world. But my absolute favorite mechanic in the game was the transformations. Being able to turn into all these creatures was awesome in itself, but also allowing players to use common sense to solve puzzles with Banjo's new form was just icing on the cake. If you want the discriminating walrus to give you a jiggy, then turn into a walrus. And if you want to survive in a piranha-filled swamp, then turn into a crocodile. Simple yet intuitive. Quoting from programmer Chris Sutherland, "The idea for transformations came about from wanting Banjo to be made small on Mumbo's mountain so that it gave the level a different sense of scale. Using my detective skills, it seems this idea may have originated from Tiny Huge Island in Mario 64. But I guess Rare further turned Banjo into a termite for good measure." With all these charming inhabitants, Rare's next step was to make suitable worlds to put them all in. Each level turned out to be huge and looked beautiful. According to Chris, the characters were created with minimal amounts of texturing, which gave them a very clean look. The backgrounds, on the other hand, had a very large number of textures. Because of this, the team was pushing the N64's memory to its limit. Hence, they faced software issues, which they fixed by developing a new method that reshuffled the memory continuously. In fact, Rare intended to have several more worlds such as Fungus Forest and Mount Fire Eyes, but unfortunately, they were left out due to time constraints. Traces of these missing worlds can be found throughout Banjo Kazooie. A photo of Fungus Forest can be seen on the wall in Banjo's house, and many fans speculate that the lava room in Banjo Kazooie was supposed to be where Mount Fire Eyes should have been, but eventually turned into Hailfire Peaks in Banjo-Tooie. On the topic of missing things, another was actually a surprise ending. According to Chris Sutherland, right before Grunty plummets off the castle, her final spell was intended to hit Banjo and turn him into a frog. While taking control of Tootie, the player would be required to find enough Mumbo tokens to transform Banjo back. Bet if Banjo Kazooie was a modern day game, we'd be getting this content through DLC, which I'd gladly purchase. Throughout the years, many gamers felt that Banjo Kazooie was a platformer that finally improved on Miyamoto's legacy, Mario 64. But the team at Rare behind Banjo Kazooie was very humble about this comparison that fans made. Quoting from Greg, "Every 3D platform game owes a respective nod to Nintendo and Miyamoto-san, and for anyone to even compare Banjo to the piece of gaming history that was Mario 64 is a great honor indeed. In my opinion though, both had different strengths and were great platformers in their own way." But what I loved most about Banjo Kazooie's gameplay was that almost every item had a purpose. Many adventure platforming games throughout history had things to collect, but was rarely used for anything intuitive, other than a high score. If you were ever an avid fan of Banjo Kazooie, then you might know of the fascinating mystery called Stop and Swap. How it worked was that players had to collect a hidden set of items in the game after entering a password found in the sequel. With both cartridges, players had 10 seconds to swap from Banjo Kazooie to Banjo-Tooie for extra content to be unlocked. However, newer models of the N64 allowed only a 1-second window to swap. Due to the swap time being too short and the risk of damaging the game cartridge being too high, Rare had to remove the feature altogether. Hackers have managed to discover these passwords to uncover the items, but unfortunately, we'll never know what they were initially intended for. Stop and Swap has been discussed and debated on various forums throughout the years, namely the Rare Witch Project. According to Greg Males, he even posted on their forums once offering to reveal all, but was dismissed as a crank. I guess some mysteries are better left unsolved, since the journey of discovering it probably brought the Banjo Kazooie community closer together. Due to the success of Banjo Kazooie, a sequel was rapidly in the works, codenamed Banjo Kazooie. The game was released in November of 2000 and renamed Banjo-Tooie. On one stormy night, 2 years after Gruntilda's defeat, Banjo and friends sit around to play a nice game of poker. Little did they know that the witch's sister were in the process of reviving her. Not long after, Grunty cast a deadly spell towards Banjo's house, which ended up killing Bottles. Ah, poor Bottles. I liked him. After seeing Spiral Mountain left in ruins, Banjo and Kazooie set off to save the day. Okay, first of all, I just want to note how much darker Banjo-Tooie is compared to Banjo-Kazooie. Bottles doesn't immediately die from Grunty's attack. He actually survived. Not only did his friends just stare at him as his burnt body took its last steps, but Kazooie also burns him by saying, "It's okay, since he wasn't everyone's favorite character?" Kazooie, I love you, but damn, gotta show some respect for the mole who taught you and Banjo everything in the first game. On a serious note, you can actually see a darker tone throughout Banjo-Tooie, both in the atmosphere and the music. Wanting to improve on the original, Rare decided to create more complex and interlocking worlds. And it's immediately noticeable the moment you step foot into the enormous hub world, Isle o' Hags. Not only that, but Banjo's moveset and buff items are carried straight from the first game. All of this can be a little overwhelming for newcomers or someone who has never completed Banjo-Kazooie. Greg Mails actually gives his opinion on this matter, and I quote, "I would say we got the balance right the first time, and perhaps made the all too common mistake of wanting bigger, better, and more for the sequel. As someone who's familiar with Banjo-Kazooie, I thought all the additions in Banjo-Tooie were awesome. I'll admit, there are a lot of gameplay changes, but all it took was a little bit of exploring and patience. After that, it was just as good, if not better than its predecessor." The game even had a special mode called Bottle's Revenge, where a second player could take control of enemies. Unfortunately, this feature was dropped. According to a developer at Rare, the official reason was we ran out of time to debug it. It did work rather well, and work well it did. Thanks to some hackers on the Rare Witch project, a GameShark code for Bottle's Revenge was released for everyone to enjoy. There's also an interesting little Easter egg I thought I'd mention. In the back room of Jolly's, you'll find a pirate named Black Guy who rants about Banjo stealing his spotlight. He's a reference to Rare's original idea for the villain in the Dream project. Now let's skip ahead to early 2008, a while after Microsoft snatched Rare away from Nintendo. During this time, Microsoft was in search of a developer to port the two Banjo titles onto Xbox Live Arcade, in hopes of refreshing players' memories. Finally, Microsoft, you did something right. They eventually handed over the duty to 4J Studios, and the entire project took about 9 months. Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie for Live Arcade was released in December of 2008 and April of 2009. The two games are essentially the same as the original, with improved graphics. There is, however, one major addition which you can probably guess: Stop and Swap. 4J Studios resurrected it, this time allowing players to unlock a handful of extra things, extending right into Banjo-Kazooie nuts and bolts. Before we wrap up, here's a fun fact. If you remember playing through the original Banjo games, there were plenty of Nintendo references which are not present in the live arcade versions. According to Patty Burns of 4J Studios, it was because Rare doesn't own the right to show trademarked or registered Nintendo things. Guess that makes sense, but it's a sad reminder for us all that Rare doesn't belong to Nintendo anymore. Well guys, that's all for part 1. In the next part, we'll take a look at what direction Rare is headed with Banjo and Kazooie. Until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.